Okay, good morning. Happy Monday. It's Miss Phairr back with you guys, kind of picking things up from where we left off and have Mr. Horton, who is going to be running our Twitter account today. So I wanted to say welcome back to those of you who's been tuning in with us from day one. And if this is your first time tuning in with us, welcome still just the same. Just a quick reminder, I am at Cambridge High School in Milton, Georgia by way of Atlanta. And this is going to be your virtual A push lesson. Last week, we left off kind of giving some shout outs to some students who have been viewing with us pretty much since the very beginning. And I mentioned to those students that if we left you off, please blame it, blame it on our heads and not our hearts. But I wanted to kind of make sure that I identify these 14 students. So Idira Diaz of Paramount High School, Valari of South Forks High School, Cameron Baltram of Plainfield East High School, Anthony Prescott of Independence High School, Elizabeth of Burbank High School, Bolivar Campusano at Mackeysport Area High School, Braden Summerford at Ottawatama Agricultural High School. We have Drew Pettit at David Crockett High School, Bella Barr at Forest Park High School, Curry at Vasha High School, Linda at Long Beach Polytech High School, Alan Zhang at St. Clair High School, and Noah Calandero at Kalua High School. I apologize if I mispronounced that. Then we have Sarah at Twin Valley, and we have Taylor Melanowski at Dover Sherborne High School. So thank you guys for tuning in and been tuning in all week. Hopefully you are here this morning with us and heard your names. For today's Twitter shout out, we're going to ask you to shout out your high school. So if you want to go ahead and kind of start leaving those tweets out there for us, again, Mr. Horton is manning the station, and so he will answer any questions that you may have, as well as kind of take a list and make sure that we got everybody accounted for. All right, so as usual, we're going to kind of talk about this is 9.5, and we're going to kind of talk about change in continuity and kind of wrapping up period 8. And the good thing about it, just kind of as a friendly reminder, that you do have a modified DBQ that is going to be your AP exam. It is going to be 5 documents instead of 7. And one of the ways that you can earn points, you earn a point if you reference an outside source outside of your documents. But now, because of the new way they're going to distribute the points, you can earn 2 points if you reference 2 outside sources of information. So, for example, if your DBQ were to come from period 6, it is a good idea that you do know some information from periods 8 or 9, because you can use one example from period 8 and another example from period 9. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so here's our question, and this is actually an AP exam question. This is a DBQ question, so we're going to work on that, because since your exam is a DBQ question, we're going to kind of talk about some methods and things that you can use when you're looking at a CCOT type of question, and ways in which you can actually perform well on your DBQ. So the question is to analyze the political and economic impact of the Cold War on American society between the years of 1945 and 1961. So, what does this mean exactly? All right. So, you have 2 things that you got to look at. You got to look at the political, and then you got to look at the economic impact. You're also paying attention to the time frame that they've given you. So, very specific, 1945 to 1961. So, you're looking at the end of World War II. You're also looking at the moments when the Cold War was kind of at its beginnings. You could reference in the Korean War. You could also mention some things that were kind of happening as far as political within certain the civil rights movements that were happening within the country. And then also too, you can kind of reference some of the presidencies and how they responded to things like Eisenhower, like Truman, and like JFK. Notice the cutoff though. So if you're going to bring in some outside information in this case, in this point, Vietnam War would actually probably be a good example. But let's just kind of talk about, let's just kind of talk about some things that you can do as we answer this question. So really quickly, this is change in continuity over time in period 8. You're going to explain the extent to which the events of the period from 1945 to 1980 reshaped the national identity. Some of your acquired skills is you've already learned how to make connections, and we're going to kind of continue on that today. You also looked at the skill of contextualization. And so for now, we're looking at argumentation. So you need to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument using a diverse and alternative evidence in order to develop a complex argument. So kind of keep that in mind when you're looking at a CCOT and you're looking at the theory of argumentation. So first thing I recommend that every student does is you have the question, you know what the question is. Before you even look at your documents, make a list. So they gave you the time frames, right? They told you the times of the Cold War. They told you from 1950 and they told you to 1961. So let's go ahead by starting out by making a list of things that could possibly be that you think that you know about. So from the 1950s, you could mention the arms race. You could talk about the baby boom. You could talk about suburbia and the changing role of women. You could talk about, again, Truman and Eisenhower, two presidents. How did they respond to certain things? You could mention the Korean War, the start of the space race. You could talk about pop culture of the 1950s, you know, the emergence of rock and roll music, the teenage movement, the idea of conformity. You can mention Brown versus Board of Education, and you can remember civil rights. And so kind of thinking back to that question about the economic and political, how do some of these things rate? Where would they fall in regards to that whole theory? As you're looking at this and thinking about the question. Now, I'm not asking you at this point to actually do anything as far as like remember this, but as far as like you have to go out and kind of discuss these things individually, but these are certain things that happened during the Cold War in America during the 1950s. So there's a kind of start of what you need to know. All right, so let's bring in the 1960s. We got the civil rights movement still happening. You have Kennedy. I brought in LBJ because he is evident within the 1960s. The tumultuous 60s, kind of talking about the fact of all of the different movements that happened, all of the the 60s and how it was the age of culture and counterculture. You have the Vietnam War. You also have the second wave of feminism, and then you also have the election of 1968. So do we have some things that are going to be out of time frame? Yes. Remember, you do get to earn points on your DBQ for any evidence that you bring from working from outside of the time period. So you get to earn 2 points for that. So if you mention or talk about something with the election of 1968, there could be your points right there if you mention that and kind of tie it into what it is that you're supposed to be doing. And then I like to bring in the 70s because, again, that's that relevant outside the information. That's where your other 2 points are coming in at. This is where you can kind of make some correlations. If you're going to bring up the civil rights movement, for example, and talk about the political impact that it had, and you talk about the acts that came about from it, you can mention the fact of how the civil rights movement will lead to other liberation movements, such as Asian Americans, such as Native Americans, such as gay and lesbian rights, and the women's feminist movement. You can mention the oil crisis. How do we get up to that point? What was happening as far as things that were happening in other, countries in the Middle East, with Afghanistan and et cetera. How do we get into the oil crisis? If you remember, Mr. Horton kind of talked about the Iran hostage situation and everything that was dealing with Jimmy Carter and how it would later, lead to his demise as far as not being elected for a second term and being a one-term president. So all of these things are ways that you can kind of tie in to kind of help answer your DBQ question. So the first thing you do when you have a DBQ question before you before you look at the document is, number one, give yourself a list to see what you know within those time periods, even outside, even prior to, even afterwards. Once you kind of get that list together and kind of put it together, the second thing I recommend is going back to the question, looking at the two categories, because you're going to have one paragraph that discusses the economic part. You're going to have another paragraph that's going to discuss the political part. So go ahead and categorize these things so that you can see, okay, this would be more political. This would be more economic. If you have another category outside of what they're asking, but remember, just stick to what the prompt says and kind of go from there. Okay, now that you have your list together, it's time to take the next step. And your next step would be to actually look at your documents. Remember, the DBQ is about making the documents work for your argument. What a common mistake that a lot of students do is that they commonly try to write the entire DBQ based around what the documents say, and it should be the other way around. You should already kind of have an idea of what your argument is going to be based off your list and things that you know. And then the documents there are just support. They're there to lend support for your argument. And so for argument's sake, go ahead and look at your documents, and then you're going to start to input what is known as the HIP method. So kind of going back again, Here's our list just to review again. So if we're going to kind of pick out some economic thing, we could talk about suburbia and the changing role of women, and about how you can kind of make the comparison of that to the comparison of what happened in the 1920s, and about consumerism. And now they have a new area of people that they can kind of pull into as far as teenagers. That's a new market. Or you can look at the role of women and how they went from going back into the home and the things that they wanted to buy from that point. If you wanted to look at some of the political side, you can use Brown versus Board of Education, which overturned Plessy versus Ferguson, which basically just said, hey, segregation is illegal inside of schools. And then you can kind of go from there. So again, we are looking very, very good in regards to how we can kind of use this in the 50s. And then the 60s, again, still tying up. You can look at the Vietnam War, the impact that it will possibly have, even though it's going to happen much later. You can kind of look at how Kennedy responded in regards to some of the things with the Cold War, about how he had this policy with the New Frontier. His focus was more so on space race versus, really trying to, assure the mutually assured destruction. And the biggest thing about here is in the civil rights movement. And then, of course, this is going to be where you're going to kind of make those outside points where you're going to kind of talk about and tie it into other periods. So let's do a little bit of guided practice. Now we're going to look at some of our documents and look at some ways that the documents can kind of help you guys as you're making your argument to support. Because remember, you're going to give yourself a brief introduction. I know the question was asked, if they repeat the question, the prompt, and they list out, does that count? Yes, you can repeat the prompt. However, when you're listing out your items, as far as you cannot just simply say there were many economic and political changes that happened in the United States from the Cold War from 1945 to 1961. You will not get a point for that. You need to be more specific. You need to talk about some of the things that are impacting. You can mention things like there were many political changes, such as many different acts that were put into place that ended discrimination for African Americans, such as the Civil Rights Act. There were many different economic changes that impacted, such as the growth of consumerism with the baby boomers and also with the teenage generation. The more specificity you have, the better it is. And don't forget, your thesis statement does not have to be one sentence. It just has to be, it can be multiple sentences, but they must be continuous. In fact, I actually recommend that you do have multiple sentences to make up your thesis statement, at least three, so that it kind of all ties together. What you're going to list are your examples to help your argument, and then in your paragraphs, you're going to talk about how those examples that you listed support your argument. So that's where you're going to provide your detail. And a lot of students assume that because they listed in their thesis statement that they're kind of giving away, or there's nothing that they have to write about within their essay, and that's not true. All right, so again, kind of going along, I want to remind you of the question again. So we're from 1945 to 1961, political and economic impact of the Cold War on American society. So let's look at our first document. So I'm going to give you a few minutes. This is the National Defense Education Act, and this is from 1958. So I'll give you a few minutes to read through this. Okay, so reading through this document and looking at it, this is something that Congress kind of brought out in 1958. This was kind of the start of the arms race. We were looking at, to give you a little bit of the historical context, we were looking at the ability of doing space exploration. So they're really kind of putting a little bit more emphasis into, the math and the sciences. And there are several things that you can take out of this. Number one, this can be considered both economic and political. Political because of the fact that it is an act. This is a law that's going to come into place. They're talking about defense. They are mentioning the fact of, mastery of modern techniques. They're talking about scientific principles and new techniques and new knowledge. So basically what they're admitting to is that there is a need for people to go back to school to learn these items, to acquire this new knowledge in order to understand those complex scientific principles and also those new techniques. In other words, we're looking at the ability to possibly launch new technology into space. What is that technology going to be used for? Is it going to be used as for spy methods? Is it going to be used to ensure that, as we are kind of looking at the growth of communism as it's happening over inside of Europe, what are these things going to be used for? Now, I said that it can be used for two different things. The other part of this is if you look at the sentence right after nation, where it says, this requires programs that will give assurance that no student of ability will be denied an opportunity for higher education because of financial need. There's your economic aspect of it. Usually back then, in order for you to be able to afford something, to go to college or to be in these certain programs, you had to be able to, be able to afford it, and that scholarships were on the basis of certain needs. And basically, what this is saying, is that it requires that no student of ability will be denied an opportunity for higher education because of financial need. It will correct as rapidly as possible the existing imbalances of our educational programs, which have led to an insufficient proportion of our population educated in science, mathematics, and modern languages and trained in technology. So there's your STEM. So what would be, if you're looking at this, I gave you the historical context. I'm talking about the fact that we're looking into the space race, we're looking into exploration. So there's your historical context. We looked at the purpose of this. The purpose of this, again, is to correct, and if you look at it, to correct the insufficient proportion in the population. They wanted to create opportunities for students to be able to have education inside of science, inside of math, inside of foreign languages, inside of technology. So they're looking at, this is a new movement. We have never had a much advancement in this area. We realize that there's a disproportionate, so we're trying to fix this. So you look at this document, you will write out these notes beside it. And remember, on your exam, you can put notes in your exam. You can write out notes beside that. That's not where your actual essay is going to come from, but you can kind of write out on the side of it, make your notes, and kind of pay attention to where you're going. And remember, documents can be used for more than one category. Now, your analysis part is coming in is when you are thinking about the purpose, or you're thinking about the point of view, or the intended audience of this, or the historical context, which is what we kind of talked about. We talked about the purpose, we talked about the historical context. The intended audience would be pretty much Americans who are seeking, or those people who they feel would need to go ahead and make those advancements into science, math, and modern foreign languages. So they're looking at the generation of students who may have left high school, those who may not have been able to go to college because they could not afford it. Hey, here's an opportunity for you to go to college. Are you good in math? Are you good in science? Did you score well on the aptitude test? Hey, here's an opportunity for you to be able to take that knowledge and to put it forth so that we can kind of start this journey as we're looking at space exploration and the possibilities of what it can mean for America. Now, when you analyze a document, and analysis is not meaning that you write statements from the document. That is actually addressing. That means that you understand that the document is there. You're writing an excerpt from the document. A lot of students make a common mistake when they think analysis is, I'm going to just write a sentence from it and I'm going to reference it. No, you're addressing it. You're not actually analyzing it. Analyzing it is looking at the deeper meaning within, which is where that HIP method kind of comes in, and you really got to understand it. And remember, I told you only have to do one. So if you choose to do historical context or intended audience or point of view or purpose, that is fine. You only have to do one. And we're going to kind of take it and look at it again with another document. So this is document number 2. This is the Treasury Secretary George M. Humphrey, and this is his testimony before a House subcommittee, and this is in 1955. So go ahead. Okay, so this is George M. Humphrey, a testimony before a House subcommittee in 1955. Um, a lot of people, when they look at who the audience will be, will automatically say, well, it's a House subcommittee. Yes and no. He is actually, the intended audience is bigger than just the House subcommittee. But what they are looking at when you're thinking about bigger picture here, when we're talking about analysis, is the interstate highway system. And of course, we all know that the adoption of the interstate highway, the highway system was something that happened under Eisenhower. And, you know, his idea was that he wanted to connect the country. He wanted the ability for people to be able to travel with ease from state to state. And so with this kind of came a little bit of, you know, you have to kind of go and get permission because he wanted to take federal funding and spend it in order to create this highway system that we have today. And so he had to go before a House subcommittee to kind of talk about the reasons behind that, kind of talking about the idea of, you know, efficiency. He talked about safety. He talked about reduced time delays, about, you know, ways in which you can, if you build this highway system, that means that a person who was living way up in California could travel to the state of Texas with some ease and vice versa. He also kind of talks about the fact that, you know, the men of goodwill and intentions must get together on a plan for starting better highway systems. And it was a very intricate system. And he was saying that this is not just a small scale, this is not just state to state, but this, I mean, just something that happens within a state, but this is on a larger, broader scale. And of course, you could use this as, yes, political, but if you're thinking about the O in like the hippo method, which is outside information, think about what this document can mean, because this document too could actually fall into both categories. And I say this economically because once the interstate highway system started getting built, what did you start to see being developed? What are you going to start to see new businesses in? You're going to start to see motels. People who travel from state to state may not want to, you know, do it all in one day. They need places to stay. So you're going to see places like Howard Johnson's that are going to develop, along with motels, restaurants, diners, places that, you know, families can do a quick stop in to get meals. And then, of course, it's going to be the birth of what happens when once they get to a location, what are they going to look for? This is, of course, the brainchild that's going to happen around this time with Disneyland in California. Now people have a reason to travel. It's not just let me get on Route 66, but of course that's probably one of the more famous ones from this interstate system. But you know, taking Route 66 from one end of you know, from the East Coast and going all the way over to the West Coast. So there's your economic part of that, and there's your outside information, and there you can actually gain a point when you look at it from a bigger standpoint. So don't just think about what the documents are being written for. Yes, it is a testimony. He is explaining why it's necessary. Basically, he's saying we need permission in order to build this highway system. We need the money. We need for the subcommittee to approve this. But it's going to be on a bigger grand scale of things. And I basically just kind of gave you an example right then of how you can take one document, look at it, think it's political, but thinking about everything you know, thinking about that list that you created and being able to tie it together so that you can make that idea so that it all kinds of come together. So there's some things from those two documents right there that you're looking at. Those are some examples of your changes. We're looking at the changes in continuity over time. There are two changes. One big change, interstate commerce is happening. You're looking at that change of how they looked at, you know, most states had to handle their own highway systems. Now he's talking about a whole federal system. With this one before that, the Education Act, looking at going into STEM, looking at those areas which they wanted to try to have growth. And of course, they wanted to not deny those people who didn't have economic opportunities the ability to have to go into those venues should they choose to. All right, so really quickly, I want to see what's going on in Twitter. We got a lot of high schools. So we got Wilson High School, Hudson High School in Massachusetts, George Washington High School, Thompson High School, Northeast Magnet in Wichita, North Point High School, Bel Air High School, Bolton High School, Baton Rouge Magnet, Howell High School in Michigan, Cristo Rey in Kansas City, Colonial Forge High, ooh, Uhari Charter Academy. We have Crystal Central Kitsap and High School, Lamar High School in Arlington, Texas, Southern High School, West Hill High School, St. Clair High School, and Calhoun High School. All right. So, hey, thanks. We appreciate it. We are really appreciative. Hopefully your teachers are here and they know that you guys are really tuning in and really kind of giving your schools a shout out. All right, so let's check for more understanding. Well, actually, I kind of went ahead and gave it to you. All right, so I gave you a different question. Still kind of looking at CCOT, which is some historians have argued that between 1945 and 1980, women have made significant gains in social and economic equality. You could support, modify, or refute this contention using specific evidence. All right, so here are some examples that you could use. You can use Roe versus Wade, 1973. This basically said that women have a right to choose. And something else that you can kind of look at is the fact that now when you look at Roe versus Wade today, they're actually modifying that depending on state by state. There has been a lot of changes that have been made to Roe versus Wade, including the person who was the defendant Roe, and that's not her name. That was actually a pseudonym that she used for the purpose of this, who now came out much later and spoke out against abortion. You do have education amendments like the Title IX Act of 1972. You could look at women's participation in political parties. People like Shirley Chisholm, the first African American to actually run and actually win and become a congressman. You could look at the way that Gloria Steinem will also inspire other people with her magazine to kind of look at women getting into politics and running for not just local offices, but offices on a larger scale. You're going to kind of see there are going to be women who are going to run for president. And this is not going to be actually the first time that women have actually made those attempts. But, especially between 1945 and 1980 with the wave of feminism, this is definitely going to kind of see that contribution there. You're going to see protection from employment discrimination for pregnant women, where they cannot be denied the ability to apply for a job or to be fired from a job because they have a baby. Their job is actually protected. And of course, if you're looking at that, if you want to kind of talk about outside information, even arguing with this, you can kind of talk about FMLA, Family Medical and Leave Act, which basically says if a person has a baby or she adopts a baby, or if a woman has a baby or she adopts a baby, she can get up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave and her job will still be protected. Reform for rape laws, abolition of laws requiring a witness to corroborate a woman's report of rape. That was something that was synonymous back then. A woman can actually go and make a charge and their investigation has to ensue. She does not have to have a witness to corroborate to say whether or not that what she was saying is either true or false. Criminalization of domestic violence. You saw an increase of domestic violence, especially at the end of World War II with certain couples, and then especially after, with Vietnam War and Korean War, because of the types of nuclear weapons that were being used or the types of weapons that were being used, PTSD, just a lot of things that were happening during that time that made domestic violence, especially for women, illegal. And then, of course, that will change much later when you kind of look at domestic violence doesn't just happen with women, it also happens with men as well. And then funding for schools that sought to counter sexist stereotypes of women. So all of these things are great examples that you could use when you look at a question like this, where it talks about how historians have argued between 1945 and 1980, women have made significant gains in social and economic equality. So after, again, there's your list. You made a list of all the different things. Now you figure out, is it social or is it economic? Once you figure out whether it's social, economic, or both, then remember, you're going to have your opening paragraph, which has your thesis over multiple statements. You're going to have one paragraph that talks about the significant gains that are social. You're going to have another paragraph that talks about significant gains that are going to be economic. And again, you're going to also kind of identify whether or not you support that, you're going to modify that, or you're going to refute it. Supporting it just basically says, yes, I believe that it's the same. Modifying it might mean something as simple as a date. I don't believe that women made significant gains between 1945 to 1980. I believe those gains came from 1980 to 1970 to 1980. And to refute it basically just means that there have been no historical gains, that women pretty much have not there's not been a change in their position whatsoever. So you're going to look at, and you possibly could address some of the things that change and some of the things that stay the same. Again, your continuities. And one big continuity definitely you can mention is feminism. The feminism wave is still alive, and today it was alive in 1945. It's still going to be present in 1980. It's just that the goals and what the people were fighting for in feminism might possibly change during that time. All right, so just to do a debrief and summary, we definitely know that if nothing else over period 8, it was an era of contradictions. It was an era where you saw a lot of changes, where you saw people who wanted to go to conformity, and you had people who were saying, let's not conform. You had a period that started off looking at African Americans and believing in segregation, to a period where they believe where segregation was going to be considered not illegal, not just in schools, but also in public places. You looked at the fact that this is going to be a era where there was a fear of communism and also nuclear annihilation, weapons of mass destruction from both sides. Who can build more nuclear weapons? Who can put those weapons where? We're looking at the idea that is economic prosperity, especially during the 1950s under Eisenhower, kind of wanting to take things back to the way things were in the 1920s, the rise of consumerism, credit cards, Tupperware parties. You also have new consumers that you can purchase who can buy from you with the teenagers. You're also looking at the war on poverty. And so as you think about those changes, those continuities, as you're looking at that question, think about all of these things and about how pivotal it was during period 8, and how you saw the end of World War II. You saw so many transitions just were happening within America, not just on the foreign side as far as dealing with the Soviet Union and dealing with the threat of communism, but also looking at domestic issues that we were dealing with. Changes that needed to happen with those civil rights movement, with liberation, laws that needed to be reviewed, even just the rise of businesses. And, we talked about, Mr. Horton talked to you about the man in the gray flannel suit, and, people buying homes in these Levitt towns, and, that whole American dream and that adoption, how some people really started doing that up until the 60s. And then the 60s, something happened. It was all about free love. It was all about living in communes. It was all about make love, not war, and protesting, and letting your hair grow long, and, wearing different types of clothing, and how long is that going to last? And, we're going to be out and be protesting. No longer are they going to accept just being a part of society. They're going to conform. They're not going to conform. They're going to begin that counterculture, the transition of music. When you think about rock and roll, and you're thinking about how, if you use Elvis as an example, and how the music transition, and then you went from that to something like Jimi Hendrix, the Doors, the Rolling Stones, all of that kind of contributes to this era of contradictions. And so your key takeaways is that our national identity became more inclusive and socially free, but less confident as far as a role as a world power. We looked at the Bay of Pigs situation, and the idea with the Cuban Missile Crisis, how that could have potentially started World War III. Had that not happened the way it happened. You're also looking at the fact that not only are we still got an enemy of Russia at the time, but also too, our relationship with Cuba is now severed because of the fact that they had nuclear weapons that they were holding on to, that they could possibly fire upon us. You looking at the fact that, the duck and cover generations, how people built shelters in their homes, all those different transitions. So if nothing else, when you're looking at this, we responded to an uncertain and unstable post-war by asserting and working to maintain a position of global leadership with far-reaching domestic and international consequences. And of course, we kind of discussed some of those, and we've been looking at all of that all last week. We talked about the new role of the civil rights movement and liberal efforts to expand the role of government, which generated a range of political and cultural responses. We talked about the post-war economic and demographic changes that had far-reaching consequences for American society, politics, and culture. And so, again, our learning objective is looking at this period from 1945 to 1980, which is period 8, how it reshaped our national identity, and it really and truly did. All right, so No questions from Twitter, but again, kind of wanted to go out there again and shout out these high schools: Mulberry High, Cherry Creek High School, Hanford West High, Sherwood High School in Maryland, South Ridge High, Oakton High, Carthage High, West Michigan Academy of Environmental Science, Penn Island Secondary School, Miller Place High School, the Penn Homeschoolers, and Ardrey Kell High School. So again, thanks for tuning in. We're going to finish this off with a little bit of exam practice. Still kind of going back to that original question, which is analyze the political and economic impact of the Cold War on American society between 1945 and 1961. Going to look at one final document. And again, kind of going along with that DBQ practice. So this is President Franklin Roosevelt's message to Congress in 1945. Okay, guys. So again, you're analyzing this. You're looking at, would this be political? Would this be economic? Some people will go automatically, because they say it's a message to Congress, and think, oh, it's political. Well, if you looked at it, even within the first sentence, he's talking about economic trade and about opening up trade within the world. So if you recall, prior to this, we had kind of went into these whole different isolationist policies, and basically where we said that we weren't going to basically engage in trade with countries that were involved in war, that we were neutral. And so there were several neutrality acts that were put into place before we entered World War II, prior to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And so now that, this is 1945, we're pretty much at the end of the war, we kind of had to go away from that. This is one of the ways that really kind of helped us, really kind of pull us out of the Great Depression, because, the Neutrality Acts kind of limited us. But with this, what Roosevelt is basically saying, kind of going along with his whole idea, the concept for a New Deal. And remember the three R's: recovery, relief, and reform. He's thinking long term. And with long term means we're going to have to do some foreign investment. It is going to be beneficial for America to invest in those foreign markets. We need to open up trade throughout the world. We don't need to penalize countries that were once our enemies. For example, we're looking at Germany. Germany was one of those possibilities. We don't need to punish those countries. What we will do is try to continue to promote capitalism, because this is the way we can beat communism, is to kind of promote more capitalism, and looking at free trade, looking at exchange rates, and kind of looking at the economic principle. If you look at what he said, establishing the principle of economic cooperation as a foundation for expanded world trade. So again, the principle of economic cooperation. In other words, we're not looking at war, we're looking at how can we benefit by us opening up, allowing and going into other countries and investing in their foreign markets and allowing them to invest in ours. We're basically uplifting both of our economies. How is that going to be beneficial? So that can be, if you want to look at it from a political side, yes, you have to look at it for the fact that he does have to get permission from Congress in order to do that. He does have to create a series of laws and put those into place. So yes, that could be political, but it too can also be an economic impact as well, because we're trying to establish our role as a global world leader. So this is where America is really going to try to assert itself as a world power. All right, guys, so something to kind of think about as you think about when you're moving forward with Mr. Horton on tomorrow. We're going to be moving into period 9, which kind of picks up more so with the Reagan presidency, kind of looking at trickle-down economics and those things, and how looking beneficial to the government. You're also going to kind of possibly talk about Bush, we're coming to the end of the Cold War. What does that look like? And also, too, you're thinking about all those different skills that we looked at today in order to practice for our DBQ. So again, we want to thank you guys for tuning in. And remember, if you are having problems with technology, or you know someone who's having problems with technology, please go to www.cb.org/tech and let them know whatever issues that you're having. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.